Hello. Just to go, that's Gracie behind me. Just to go over some material from Chapter 9. So we're looking ahead to Chapter 9. And that Chapter 9 finishes off our look at the Greek gods, specifically at the Olympian gods, by looking at the god Dionysus. So Apollo and Dionysus can be seen as a complementary pair, right? So they're pairs of opposites, right? Remember, we talked about structuralism. Apollo represents rationality. Dionysus represents the irrational. And the Greeks considered the irrational an important part of being human, and so Dionysus does have a part. They don't want Dionysus to be running their lives. But it's still an important part, Apollo represents structure versus maybe Dionysus representing inspiration. Apollo is a god who's generally called Apollo who shoots from afar. He's a distant god. He's not an up-close personal god, whereas Dionysus is the most up-close and personal god, even maybe trumping Hermes, who's also a pretty up-close and personal god. Because in the case of Dionysus, he's the god of wine. So when you, in fact, consume wine, you are consuming Dionysus, right? It becomes a form of communion, and the god is then with you, right? So that's different. One other thing that I want to mention is Friedrich Nietzsche used Apollo and Dionysus. Nietzsche, famous German philosopher, but he began as a classics professor. That was his sort of day job while he was coming up with his philosophy. So he wrote a work on looking at Apollo and Dionysus and saw them as opposite sort of things. But he saw art basically as driven between the dynamism between the two. Apollo representing formalism. If you wrote a symphony in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, classical symphonies are very structured. You don't have a lot of dissonance. There's not a lot of things out of place. Everything sort of fits, right? It's like a puzzle where every piece fits. There's a movement then to a much more emotional art later, which has a lot of dissonance and has some other things. And so Apollo represents that sort of sticking close to form and making sure that it's formally correct. Dionysus represents that creative impulse. So they're two different things. Dionysus was he was the god of wine, but he was also the god of drama. And in Athens, there was there were a couple of festivals where there were plays, but the main one was the city Dionysia. It took place in March. It was a week-long festival. There were 3 days of tragedies and then 1 day of comedies. There were 3 days that had 3 tragedies each and a satyr play, which was a comic version of mythology. And then on the last day, the day that had the comedy, there were 5 plays performed, 5 comedies performed. And the Athenian comedies, the original comedies, what's called old comedy, these were wild, they were irreverent, there's lots of sex jokes, and they are politically savage. They're basically savage critiques of Athenian politics. So think of The Daily Show this week with John Oliver, last week tonight with John Oliver, those sort of things, and how politically crazy they are. So I'm still working here, and so we've got Dionysus, the god of tragedy and comedy both. Tragedy seems to have developed originally from a worship of Dionysus. There would be songs sung about Dionysus. His story would be sung in song. And then they get the idea of having one of the people in the chorus split off from the chorus and play Dionysus, and he would interact with the chorus. And then later they decided, well, why do we have Dionysus, another character? And then finally there would ended up being three characters could be on the stage at the same time. What happened over time was that tragedy moved away from Dionysus in that the only play we have about Dionysus is actually the Bacchae, which is one of the last tragedies written. But tragedy and comedy were both Athenian things, and they were for this festival in March called the City Dionysia. The main selection in chapter 9 is from Euripides' Bacchae. It is one of Euripides' last plays. He wrote it probably in 406, the year that he died. It was performed after his death in Athens, and he won a posthumous first prize for the productions that year. Now, we have two plays from that production. We have the Bacchae, we have the Iphigenia at Aulis. The Iphigenia at Aulis is a very patriotic play, and that might be why he won first prize. But the Bacchae is sort of an amazing play. It is not an easy play to watch because we see a character basically sort of disintegrated by Dionysus. So Dionysus plots the destruction of this character and then carries it out, which is not maybe how we would see deities, right? So there's this sort of devious plan to bring down Pentheus, the man who's trying to stop the worship of Dionysus. It really Dionysus comes across as pretty cruel and pretty devious. And some people have seen the play as an attack on Greek religion, which is possible because Euripides seems to be sort of a skeptic. But the fact that he won, even though it was posthumous, that he won first prize, and this was one of the plays, I can't think the Athenian audience was looking to diss their gods at a time when their city was sort of falling apart because of the end of the Peloponnesian War. So it seems unlikely that the Athenians took this as a criticism, but Dionysus can be a blessing, but he can also be a curse. The scholarship in chapter 9 is an article by a man named Eric Zappo, and his main point is that the worship of Dionysus upends the normal, right? So unlike the types of rituals that Van Gennep was looking at, right, which are rituals of elevation, that you're going to change your status to something else, and those are sort of permanent, right? You do something and now you're something else, and then you return, but you're different. This upends the normal, but then the normal returns, right? So like you go to Mardi Gras, you have a wild time at Mardi Gras, then you go back to your regular life. That's sort of the idea. And of course, it's involves cross-dressing, involves sort of worshiping this gigantic phallus and all sorts of wild stuff that would happen, just like Mardi Gras. So in the case of the city Dionysia, imagine that most of that festival, the stuff surrounding it, were probably wild parties like Mardi Gras. But then you had the dramatic theater festival in the middle of that. Chapter 9, section 3 is a poem by Catullus. Catullus' poems don't have names, they're just numbers. This is Catullus' poem 63. It tells the story of Attis, who becomes a worshiper of Cybele. Cybele, remember, is a wild, sort of, she represents the wild, and her priests were castrated. That was the if you wanted to be a priest of Cybele, you had to undergo castration. The Romans did have a temple of Cybele, and they did have rituals there that were overseen by these castrated priests, but there was a law that said Roman citizens could not become priests of Cybele. So she was this strange enough that the Romans really didn't sort of care for her much, but they felt that it was necessary to sort of at least acknowledge her. But in the poem by Catullus is amazing. I mean, within the first 10 lines of the poem, or first 15 lines or so of the poem, you've got Attis. He arrives from Greece to Asia Minor. He gets in this wild ritual. He castrates himself. And then, soon after that, he passes out. And it's all sort of very wild. I mean, the language really represents what's going on, and it all happens so quickly. And then he gets up the next day, and he regrets what happened. He thinks about what he had been before and what he is now, and he feels sort of ashamed and everything else. And it has like a wild ending where Cybele sends a lion after him, and he chases him into the woods. So it does tell the story of Attis, but it's from a Roman poet, and even though Catullus was a poet who wrote love poems, wrote sex poems, and it didn't have really a problem with various sexual stuff, he's still a Roman, and so the Romans really find the worship of Cybele so weird that Attis here is not a great figure. And then it says 8:4, but it's chapter 9 for Dionysus in 69. We're looking at the modern takes on Dionysus. In 1969, there was a play done in New York City off Broadway called Dionysus in 69. And the play was basically the Bacchae, but the difference was that the seats of the theater were surrounded the stage, and the actors would go in and out of the seating area, and people who were watching were invited to actually join the actors on stage and participate in some of the rituals. So it's a very sort of like, there was an invitation for people to get involved. So this is very sort of a wild experimental thing going on in 1969. There was another, there are some other pieces that are mentioned. Rocky Horror Picture Show is mentioned, but one that's sort of an opera of sorts by a man named Harry Parch called Revelation in Courthouse Park. And what I want to say about Revelation in Courthouse Park is this particular work it's doing two things simultaneously. So you've got, on the one hand, the story of Pentheus and Dionysus, and Pentheus and his mother, and then you've got the story of a rock star named Dion coming to this town, and the split between the mayor, who's very sort of strict-minded, and his mother, who's very much sort of in favor of this, she sort of caught the fever of rock and roll. So you've got the split between the two. So it updates the story to the 1950s, and figures like Elvis coming to small towns, and these ordinarily staid people like lose their minds, right? Think Beatlemania, that type of thing. But it's still a nice reflection on that. And I've never had a chance to see a production of this. There are recordings of the piece, but I've never seen a video. There's no video recording that I know of. If this ever comes to Kansas City, I will be definitely one of the people going to see it. So that said, I think that sort of is at least enough of a preview of Chapter 9. I will see you next week, and we'll go over Chapter 9 and look ahead to Chapter 10 and the stuff on heroes.